Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been talking a lot about different grants. I want to be very specific about Office of Justice Program grants. There were $35 million worth of grants that were approved in a bipartisan way in this committee, grants that invest in things that are really vital to the public safety of our community. I know, again, we are in a room full of people who want to see crime go down. Republicans and Democrats, law enforcement officers have spoken to the urgency of these programs which deal with school violence, which divert people into substance abuse and treatment, and supportive services. Community violence intervention programs, again, bipartisan programs that this committee really worked hard on this. I've heard what you've said to others on the committee, Patty Murray in an appropriations committee, that members should reach out to you if they want those grants reinstated. I've written letters, but I am hoping that you and I can have a conversation. $35 million.
Yeah, and Senator Booker, I had stated earlier that yes, we did terminate grants. We have an appeal process. We have turned some back on. We are appealing. We are looking at some we have denied, some are still pending. I believe we have multiple appeals pending with New Jersey, and I would be happy to sit down with you and look at those appeals. I believe one is with the city of New Jersey. I know there are multiple ones pending, but of course, I would be happy to sit down with you or any senator or any House member and look at grants that have been terminated. I've been doing that, and I would welcome that.
But I will be the first one you sit down with, correct?
Absolutely. I'd love to sit down with you on that. I'll look at those tomorrow.
Okay, so the nuclear option, a Republican crisis. The digital landscape is currently engulfed in a firestorm of speculation, frantic headlines, and viral warnings. If you have spent any time on social media over the last 48 hours, you have likely seen the claims. Attorney General Pam Bondi is facing immediate imprisonment. A judge has supposedly ordered her detention. The Justice Department is reportedly in a state of total collapse. It is the kind of news that stops a scroll and triggers 1,000 frantic shares. But as is often the case when the internet catches fire, the truth is far more nuanced, significantly more dangerous, and potentially more historic than the rumors suggest. First, we must clear the air of the noise. No judge has issued a warrant for Pam Bondi's arrest. There is no courtroom drama currently unfolding where a gavel is being hammered down on the Attorney General's freedom. That specific narrative is a fabrication of the digital age. However, the reality of the situation is arguably more explosive. While the threat is not coming from a courtroom, it is coming from the halls of the United States House of Representatives. And the mechanism they are preparing to use is a constitutional nuclear option that has not been deployed in nearly a century. This is the story of inherent contempt, a power so absolute and so rare that its mere mention has sent shockwaves through the executive branch. At the center of this storm are the Jeffrey Epstein files, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that the American public has been demanding for years. These files are not just paper. They are a ledger of power, influence, and alleged systemic depravity. Congress passed a clear bipartisan mandate requiring the Department of Justice, under the leadership of Attorney General Pam Bondi, to release these files in their full, unredacted form. The law was explicit: no black boxes, no hidden names, and no excuses. The deadline arrived, and the Justice Department did indeed deliver a massive document dump. But as lawmakers began to peel back the covers of these files, the atmosphere in Washington turned from anticipation to pure, unadulterated fury. What the DOJ provided was not the transparency promised by the law. Instead, it was a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. The files were littered with redactions. Entire sections were obscured by heavy black ink. Names of associates, details of financial transactions, and critical investigative leads were missing. For lawmakers like Representative Khanna, a Democrat from California, and Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, this was not just a legal failure, it was a deliberate act of defiance against the legislative branch. In their eyes, Pam Bondi had not just failed to follow a directive, she had effectively declared the Justice Department above the law. This defiance has led us to the precipice of a constitutional showdown. Khanna and Massie, standing on opposite ends of the political spectrum, have found common ground in their anger. They are now moving forward with a privileged resolution for inherent contempt. To understand why this is so significant, you have to understand the sheer weight of that term. In a standard contempt of Congress proceeding, the House votes to refer the matter to the Justice Department for prosecution. But when the person you are holding in contempt is the head of that very Justice Department, The standard process becomes a circular joke. You cannot ask the Attorney General to prosecute herself. That is why the inherent part of inherent contempt is so vital. It is a dormant power, rooted in the very fabric of the Constitution, that allows Congress to act as its own judge, jury, and jailer. If this resolution passes, the House does not need a judge. They do not need a trial in a traditional court. They can authorize the Sergeant-at-Arms to physically take Pam Bondi into custody and detain her in a Capitol Hill holding cell until she complies with the law and releases the unredacted Epstein files. This is not a metaphor. This is not political theater. This is a direct exercise of raw legislative power. We are looking at a scenario where the top law enforcement official in the United States could be arrested by the legislative branch's own security force. It is a move that would trigger an immediate and unprecedented crisis of the separation of powers. It would pit the Sergeant-at-Arms against the Department of Justice and the House of Representatives against the White House. As we peel back the layers of this story, we see that this isn't just about a few redacted pages. It is a battle over who truly holds the final word in the American system of government. Is the Attorney General an independent arbiter of justice, or is she a shield for the powerful? Does Congress have the teeth to enforce the laws it passes, or is its oversight power merely a suggestion? The stakes could not be higher, and the clock is ticking. Within the next 48 hours, the House may be forced to vote on whether to deploy this nuclear option, and the result could change the face of the American government forever, a history of defiance. To understand why Congress is currently reaching for its most extreme legal weapon, we have to look back at the trail of breadcrumbs that led us to this moment. This isn't a sudden flare-up or a misunderstanding over a few misplaced documents. This is the culmination of what lawmakers are describing as a calculated long-term strategy of stonewalling. When Pam Bondi was first nominated for the position of Attorney General, she entered the fray with a promise that resonated across both sides of the aisle: transparency. During her confirmation hearings, she spoke with a sense of urgency about the Jeffrey Epstein case. She acknowledged that the American public had been left in the dark for too long and stated, quite clearly, that the era of secrecy regarding Epstein's high-level connections was over. For a brief moment, there was a rare sense of unity in Washington. Democrats and Republicans alike praised her commitment. They believed that, finally, a leader at the Department of Justice was willing to follow the trail wherever it led, regardless of the political fallout. But as soon as the ink was dry on her commission, the tone began to shift. The language of transparency was slowly replaced by the language of procedural caution. The bold promises of full disclosure were quietly swapped for warnings about legal constraints, privacy protections, and the sanctity of ongoing investigations. The first major crack in the facade appeared in October 2025. Pam Bondi was called to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee for what was billed as a routine oversight hearing, but the atmosphere was anything but routine. For over 4 grueling hours, senators grilled the Attorney General on the status of the Epstein files. They wanted to know why the timeline for release was being pushed back. They wanted to know why the DOJ was suddenly claiming that certain flight logs and investigative memos were sensitive. During that hearing, the Attorney General's performance was a masterclass in what political analysts call the pivot. When asked direct questions about Donald Trump's past associations with Epstein, she cited department policy against discussing individuals not currently under indictment. When asked why her position on the files had shifted so dramatically since her confirmation, she retreated into the technicalities of executive privilege and internal DOJ protocols. She didn't just dodge questions, she effectively built a fortress of legalese around herself. The frustration in the room was palpable. Senators who had initially supported her nomination felt a deep sense of betrayal. One prominent lawmaker remarked after the hearing that they had walked in expecting answers and walked out feeling like they had been subjected to a 4-hour lecture on how to say nothing with a lot of words. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a breakdown of the oversight process. Headlines the next morning were brutal, describing her testimony as a dodge and deflect strategy designed to run out the clock on congressional inquiries. But the October hearing was just the prelude. The real breaking point came when the legislatively mandated deadline for the full release of the Epstein files finally arrived. Congress had been very specific in the law they passed. The files were to be unredacted. This was a bipartisan directive aimed at preventing the very thing the DOJ had done for decades, using privacy as a shield to protect powerful associates of the late financier. When the document dump finally happened, and lawmakers saw the sheer volume of black ink covering the pages, the stonewalling narrative moved from a suspicion to a confirmed reality in the minds of many on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers didn't just see redacted names, they saw a middle finger to the legislative branch. They saw the Attorney General technically complying with the delivery of the files while practically violating the content requirements of the law. This is a classic bureaucratic maneuver. If you are forced to give someone a book, you give it to them, but you tear out every second page and soak the rest in ink. You can claim you handed over the book, but the information is gone. This history is why the threat of inherent contempt is being taken so seriously now. Khanna and Massie aren't just reacting to a single document dump, they are reacting to a perceived pattern of deception. They believe that Pam Bondi has spent her entire tenure as Attorney General shielding the truth about Jeffrey Epstein from the public eye. They are convinced that she is protecting someone or perhaps multiple people at the highest levels of power. The question that is now haunting the halls of Congress is simple. Who is being protected? Is it the former associates of Epstein who still hold positions of influence? Is it the institutional reputation of the FBI and the DOJ itself, which many believe failed to investigate Epstein properly for decades? Or is it, as many critics suggest, an attempt to insulate the presidency from uncomfortable revelations? By refusing to answer the why behind her shift in policy, Bondi has left a vacuum that is being filled by suspicion and constitutional aggression. This is no longer a debate about the best way to release documents. It is a war over the fundamental right of the people's representatives to see what the government is doing in their name. The Attorney General is betting that the traditional tools of oversight are too slow to catch her. Congress, led by an unlikely duo of a progressive and a libertarian, is betting that they can revive a dormant power to stop her in her tracks. The stage is now set. The history of stonewalling has led to a moment of unprecedented confrontation. If the Attorney General thought that 4 hours of dodging questions in October would be the end of it, she severely underestimated the resolve of a Congress that feels it has been lied to. We are now moving beyond hearings and into the realm of enforcement. The mechanics of the trap. Unpacking inherent contempt. To truly grasp the gravity of the threat facing Attorney General Pam Bondi, we need to step away from the political rhetoric and examine the legal machinery currently being polished for use on Capitol Hill. Most Americans are familiar with the term contempt of Congress, but in the modern era, it has largely become a toothless tiger. Usually, when a government official defies a subpoena, the House or Senate votes on a criminal contempt citation. That citation is then sent to the Department of Justice for prosecution. But herein lies the fatal flaw in the system. When the person in contempt is the head of the Department of Justice, the process hits a dead end. You are essentially asking the defendant to act as their own prosecutor. It is a conflict of interest so profound that it renders the entire process an exercise in futility. This is precisely why Representatives Khanna and Massie are bypassing the standard route and reaching for the inherent contempt power. To call this the nuclear option is not an exaggeration. It is a dormant, yet fully functional, constitutional authority that allows Congress to enforce its own will without the help of the executive branch or the permission of the federal courts. It is the ultimate expression of legislative independence, and its reactivation would be the political equivalent of a magnitude 10 earthquake. So, how does it actually work? Inherent contempt is rooted in the idea that for a legislature to function, it must have the power to compel information. Without the ability to see what the executive is doing, the power of the purse and the power to write laws are effectively neutralized. The Supreme Court affirmed this power as far back as 1821 in the case of Anderson versus Dunn, and it was used most famously in 1935 during the trial of William McCracken. Since then, it has sat on the shelf, gathering dust, as Congress grew reliant on the courts. But it was never repealed. It remains live ammunition in the constitutional magazine. The process begins with a privileged resolution. In the lexicon of Washington, privileged is a word that carries immense weight. Most bills can be buried in committees or ignored by leadership for months. A privileged resolution is different. Once it is introduced on the floor of the House, the chamber is legally required to act upon it within 2 legislative days. It forces a vote. It forces every member of Congress to go on the record. Do you support the Attorney General's right to keep these files secret, or do you support the House's right to see them? For Pam Bondi, this means the clock is not just ticking, it is screaming. If the House votes to hold the Attorney General in inherent contempt, the Speaker of the House issues a warrant. But this warrant doesn't go to the FBI or the U.S. Marshals, agencies that report to Bondi herself. It goes to the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House of Representatives. The Sergeant-at-Arms is the chief law enforcement officer of the chamber, and under an inherent contempt resolution, they are authorized to take the subject into physical custody. Imagine the scene. The Sergeant-at-Arms, accompanied by the Capitol Police, arriving at the Department of Justice to arrest the Attorney General of the United States. This isn't a scene from a political thriller, it is the literal procedure prescribed by inherent contempt. Once detained, the individual is not taken to a federal prison. They are held in a location within the Capitol complex, traditionally described as a Capitol jail or a designated room, and they are kept there until they agree to comply with a congressional demand. There is no trial in the traditional sense, and there is no standard bail process. The prisoner is held at the pleasure of the House until the end of the current legislative session or until they produce the requested documents. This is why the Bondi situation is so dangerous. If she continues to provide redacted files, and the House passes this resolution, we move into a space where the traditional rules of engagement no longer apply. The executive branch cannot simply pardon her out of this situation because a presidential pardon only applies to federal crimes, and inherent contempt is a legislative act of self-defense, not a criminal conviction. Legal experts are already debating what would happen if the Sergeant-at-Arms attempted such an arrest. Would the Attorney General's own security detail, federal agents, be forced to defend her against the Capitol Police? Would the Supreme Court intervene in hours to stay the arrest? We are talking about a direct physical and legal confrontation between two branches of government. But for Khanna and Massie, the risk of chaos is outweighed by the risk of silence. They argue that if an Attorney General can simply ignore a law requiring the release of documents as significant as the Epstein files, then the law itself is a fiction. They are using the threat of detention to strip away the comfort of the slow walk. They want to force Pam Bondi to make a choice: transparency or a holding cell. This mechanism is designed to be brutal because it is a tool of last resort. It is meant to be so unpalatable and so extreme that the threat alone should be enough to force compliance. But we are living in an era where unprecedented is the new normal. If Pam Bondi believes she can hide behind executive privilege and wait for the courts to decide, she may find herself waiting behind a locked door in the basement of the Capitol instead. The mechanics of the trap are set, the resolution is drafted, and the House is preparing to pull the lever. The unlikely alliance, a bipartisan front. In the modern political landscape, Washington, D.C. is often viewed as a place of absolute, unyielding tribalism. We are accustomed to seeing Democrats and Republicans retreat to their respective corners, engaging in a perpetual tug-of-war where every issue is filtered through the lens of partisan advantage. But every so often, an issue emerges that is so explosive and a perceived overreach so egregious that the traditional battle lines simply dissolve. This is exactly what we are witnessing with the push to hold Attorney General Pam Bondi in inherent contempt. The names leading the charge, Representative Khanna and Representative Thomas Massie, tell a story of a Washington that has reached its breaking point. On the surface, Khanna and Massie share almost nothing in common. Khanna is a staunch progressive from California's Silicon Valley, a champion of government reform and a vocal critic of the Trump administration's policies. Thomas Massie is a fiercely independent libertarian Republican from Kentucky, known for his rigorous defense of constitutional originalism and his frequent willingness to buck his own party's leadership. Under normal circumstances, these two would rarely agree on the time of day, let alone a strategy as radical as arresting a sitting cabinet member. Yet here they are, standing shoulder to shoulder on the House floor, united by a singular demand: the full, unredacted truth about Jeffrey Epstein. This bipartisan alliance is the most dangerous element of the situation for Pam Bondi and the White House. When a Democrat attacks a Republican official, it is easily dismissed as a partisan witch hunt. When a Republican attacks a Democrat, it is labeled as political theater. But when you have a progressive and a libertarian co-authoring a resolution to deploy the nuclear option, the partisan defense begins to crumble. It signals to the American public that this isn't about scoring points for the next election cycle. It's about a fundamental breakdown in the system of checks and balances. The political risk for both sides is immense. For Thomas Massie and other Republicans who might support this resolution, they are effectively declaring war on their own party's executive branch. They are challenging a president who demands absolute loyalty and an attorney general who is seen as the guardian of the administration's legal interests. For Khanna and the Democrats, there is the risk of being seen as weaponizing the House's obscure powers, a move that could set a precedent used against them the next time a Democrat sits in the Oval Office. Yet both men seem to have calculated that the Epstein files represent a third rail of American politics, an issue where the public's desire for accountability outweighs their party loyalty. The Epstein case is unique because it touches on the deepest fears and suspicions of the electorate, that there is a class of people so powerful, so well-connected, and so protected that they are effectively immune to the laws that govern everyone else. By stonewalling the release of these files, Pam Bondi isn't just protecting a few names. In the eyes of these lawmakers, she is validating that very suspicion. During their joint press conferences and floor speeches, Khanna and Massie have been remarkably consistent. They argue that this isn't just about Jeffrey Epstein the individual, who is, of course, deceased. It is about the network of enablers, associates, and protectors who allowed his crimes to persist for decades. They are tapping into a vein of public anger that spans the entire political spectrum. Whether you are a conservative who believes the deep state is hiding the truth, or a liberal who believes the billionaire class is above the law, you want those files opened. This shared public sentiment provides the political cover for this unlikely alliance to move forward. The White House is currently in a difficult position. If they lean too hard into protecting Bondi, they risk appearing as though they are personally hiding something within those blacked-out redactions. If they allow her to be held in contempt, they suffer a massive blow to the authority of the executive branch. Trump's base is equally conflicted. While they generally support his appointees, many of his supporters have also been the most vocal in demanding the release of the Epstein flight logs and investigative reports. The administration is essentially being squeezed between its own political appointees and its own constituency. What we are seeing is a test of whether the legislative branch can still function as a unified body when its core authorities are challenged. If Khanna and Massie can bring enough members from both parties along with them, they will have achieved something that hasn't happened in decades: a truly bipartisan exercise of raw congressional power. It would send a message to every future Attorney General and every future president that there are limits to the slow walk and that the House of Representatives still possesses the teeth to enforce its mandates. As the resolution moves toward a floor vote, the pressure on rank-and-file members of Congress is mounting. They are being forced to choose between the institutional power of the House and the political safety of their party platforms. But with the Epstein files as the prize, the cost of silence is becoming higher than the cost of action. The alliance between the progressive and the libertarian has set the stage for a vote that will define the legacy of this Congress and the future of the American legal system. The final stand. A republic at the crossroads. We now stand at the final precipice of a confrontation that could redefine the very nature of American governance. As the House of Representatives prepares to vote on the inherent contempt resolution against Attorney General Pam Bondi, we are moving beyond mere political theater and into the realm of a historical emergency. This is no longer just a debate over document redactions or the legacy of a disgraced financier. It has transformed into a fundamental test of the American system, a high-stakes collision between the executive branch's claim of absolute privilege and the legislative branch's right to oversee the law. If the House pulls the trigger on this nuclear option, the ripples will be felt for generations. The coming days will likely witness a spectacle that sounds more like a fever dream of a legal thriller than a reality of modern Washington. Picture the scene that is now being discussed in the quiet corners of the Capitol. The Sergeant-at-Arms, acting under the direct authority of the Speaker of the House, arriving at the Department of Justice. This would not be a polite visit. It would be a confrontation of jurisdictions. On one side, you have the Capitol Police, sworn to uphold the mandates of the people's representatives. On the other side, you have the federal agents of the DOJ and the Secret Service, sworn to protect the executive branch and its officials. This physical manifestation of the separation of powers is a scenario that the Founding Fathers feared, a direct, potentially physical clash between two co-equal branches of government. The legal battle that would follow such an arrest would be swift and ferocious. Before the door of a Capitol holding cell could even close, the White House would undoubtedly file for an emergency injunction at the Supreme Court. The president would argue that the legislative branch has no authority to detain a member of the cabinet, claiming that such an act constitutes an unconstitutional encroachment on the executive. They would likely lean heavily on the unitary executive theory, the idea that the president has near total control over the executive branch and its information. However, the House would counter with nearly 200 years of precedent. They would argue that if the president can simply order an attorney general to ignore a legally mandated disclosure, then Congress is no longer a co-equal branch, it is a subordinate one. The Supreme Court, which has traditionally been hesitant to step into these political thickets, would be forced to decide, does the House of Representatives have the inherent power to enforce its own will, or is the Attorney General a protected entity, untouchable by the lawmakers who confirm her? The ruling would either restore the teeth to congressional oversight or effectively grant the executive branch a permanent shield of secrecy. But beneath the legal technicalities lies the question that every American is asking. What is so explosive in those Epstein files that the Department of Justice is willing to risk a constitutional crisis to keep it hidden? We are talking about documents that could potentially name some of the most powerful people in the world, individuals who have successfully avoided scrutiny for decades. If Pam Bondi is indeed stonewalling, as the bipartisan coalition alleges, she is doing so under the shadow of a profound public suspicion. Are these redactions protecting national security, as the DOJ claims, or are they protecting the reputations of the political and economic elite? The sheer intensity of the House's reaction suggests they believe the latter is true. The outcome of this showdown will send a message to every future administration. If Bondi successfully defies the House and avoids detention, it will signal the end of effective congressional oversight. It will prove that an Attorney General can simply run out the clock and use redactions as a weapon of silence. If, however, the inherent contempt power is successfully deployed, or even if the threat of it forces Bondi to finally release the unredacted files, it will mark a massive resurgence of legislative power. It will be a reminder that in the United States, no office, not even the Attorney General, is above the law or beyond the reach of the people's representatives. As we watch this play out, we are seeing the American system of checks and balances under the greatest strain it has faced in a century. We are seeing a progressive from California and a libertarian from Kentucky trying to hold the line on transparency. We are seeing an Attorney General betting her career on the shield of executive privilege. And we are seeing a public that is increasingly tired of secrets, tired of redactions, and tired of a justice system that seems to have two different sets of rules. The next few weeks will decide the fate of the Epstein files, but more importantly, they will decide the fate of our constitutional order. Whatever happens next, whether it's a late-night arrest on Capitol Hill or a landmark ruling from the Supreme Court, Washington will never be the same. The nuclear option has been armed, the countdown has begun, and for the first time in a very long time, the executive branch may find that no is an answer that Congress simply refuses to accept. The situation is fluid, and the stakes could not be higher. We will be here to provide you with the facts, the context, and the analysis as this historic story unfolds. If you want to understand the real game being played in Washington, the one behind the viral headlines and the social media noise, you need to stay informed. This has been a deep dive into one of the most significant constitutional battles of our time. If you found this analysis helpful, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you join a community dedicated to looking past the rhetoric and finding the truth behind the power plays in Washington, London, and beyond. Make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update on the Bondi case and the Epstein files. Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant.